Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's session of the Asia Water Forum 2022. And our session today will be covering the digital water revolution in Asia and the Pacific. And my name is Thomas Abel, and I am the ADB's Chief of Digital Technology for Development. And we have a great panel today to talk about the opportunities for digital to revolutionize water resources. And so just a quick opening remarks. I just want to say that, we all know how technology is revolutionizing so many areas of development around things like AI and IoT, Internet of Things, cloud computing. We have satellite technology that can now measure all kinds of information related to water, like precipitation, evaporation, soil moisture, etc. And these technologies have moved ahead so quickly, it's almost hard for us to stay on top of the science, that's being made available. And today's session, we really want to hear from a few key thought leaders in this area to help us understand where the main opportunities are and what partnerships can be available and what some of the leading organizations are doing. Our panel will basically discuss the digital water revolution and its implications for Asia and the Pacific in terms of opportunities, constraints, and how any issues can be overcome. So we have 4 speakers, and I'll quickly introduce them. First, Nita Pokharel, who's the chief of Asian Development Bank's water sector. We also have Kala Murthy. Sorry, I can't pronounce your last name well. Then Monica Bennett, Vinod Singh, and I will introduce each of you a little bit before we get started. So Nita, as chief of water sector, has over 25 years of experience in ADB, the private sector, and international firms and NGOs across various water disciplines. She also leads strategic development for ADB's water sector and provides knowledge management and implementation support for our operational departments to meet ADB's goals around resilient and water secure Asia. Anita is basically the host of the forum this year, and it's being run very well so far. Thanks, Anita. We also have Monica Bennett, who leads the Global Infrastructure Hub's thought leadership efforts, delivering strategic initiatives and creating knowledge for G20 on new and emerging topics in infrastructure. So recently, this has involved the creation and dissemination of data tools, roadmaps, and frameworks on sustainable infrastructure investments, infratech, infrastructure transition pathways, and circular economy. Over the last 18 years, her experience has spanned engineering, management consulting, technology, and innovation. Kala is an internationally recognized water resource management expert with particular expertise in urban water issues. He has published extensively and has a strong international profile working with the World Bank, UN Habitat, UNESCO, GWT, CIWI, and the EU. And prior to joining the International Water Association Management Institute, he was a deputy director general for IMI, the International Water Management Institute. And he's currently a professor at the Indian Institute of Technology, Madras, and he's a PhD and MSc in environmental engineering. Welcome, Kala. And then our 4th panelist is Vinod Singh. Vinod is a regional director for Asia and India for Jacobs, and he is a council member for the Singapore Water Association and is an infrastructure committee member of the Singapore Business Federation. He's a leading digital transformation in water infrastructure sector with technologies like IoT, data analytics, AI, machine learning, in order to drive efficiencies and predictability. So welcome to our panelists, and we'll jump into the way we're going to structure this. We're going to have first a quick 2-minute round for each of you to answer one simple question, and then we'll go into more specific questions, and Monica has a brief presentation as well. So first, the first question is, from your perspective, what are the main drivers and opportunities offered by digital technologies in the water sector? And we'll start with Nita. Go ahead, Nita.
Thank you, Thomas. Yes, what are the drivers and opportunities is the state of affairs we have in our region. At ADB, we focus in making our region more water secure and resilient. We work with policymakers, water managers on the ground in both urban and rural spaces, ministries, regulators, irrigation managers, water resource managers, and the drivers and opportunities are the 2 billion people in our region who still do not have access to basic water and sanitation services. We are also the most disaster-affected region in the world, mostly water-related, and have the least water resources per capita. 80% of our wastewater from our cities, we have over 50% of mega cities in the world, they discharge water directly untreated into water bodies. And on average, our non-revenue water for water utilities in developing Asia is around 50%. So we cannot afford to do business as usual. And not only in all these aspects of our SDG targets and water that we're running behind, if you add, Thomas, the disruptors to this mix, climate change, pandemics such as the one we've just seen, disasters, financial and other stresses, we know all the more we cannot do business as usual. For example, I love this number. If we do nothing, with a 2-degree temperature rise with climate change, the disaster-related damages in our region alone are expected to cost us nearly 15% of our region's entire GDP in the next 10 years. And we talked a lot about GDP losses yesterday in the financing session. So these are our drivers. And these give us opportunity also. Digitalization gives us multiple entry points for making our sector more sustainable, more resilient, and more inclusive. And I can dive into those as we go further. And next opportunity, I just want to highlight the baseline of where we are with digitalization in developing Asia in our sector is extremely low. And we have a very young, tech-savvy, growing population, which can harness and embed it where the baseline is so low to making us more resilient, more sustainable, and more inclusive. And in the last is, of course, we've seen the pandemic itself has come as a driver, as an opportunity. It has given us this much-needed push towards adopting digital and space technology. And let me stop here and hear from other panelists.
Great. Thanks, Nita. Monica, your response on that question?
Yeah, sure. So I guess to respond to that question, I would probably bring it to infrastructure more generally and why the G20 is interested in infrastructure. So, infrastructure being the backbone of the economy, if you do it right, there's a potential to deliver transformative economic, social, and environmental impact. And that's obviously a highly complex landscape that can be quite costly to deliver. But the role that technology can really play there is obviously to make that more efficient and to maximize some of the benefits, from the investments being made into that kind of transformative infrastructure. But it also helps to achieve, some of the more sort of aspirational global goals, looking at, bridging the infrastructure financing gap, especially when we're looking at the climate transition, being able to facilitate a sustainable recovery from COVID and, being able to address social disparities. And so, the implications as well of not achieving that on GDP losses is obviously, an important factor in technology being a prioritized agenda under the G20 Infrastructure Working Group.
Great, thanks, Monica. And Kala, you're next.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep, sounds great.
Yeah, so I sort of, I think what's been said by the previous speakers is really the critical driver from an IWA perspective. So it's really, the global change pressures that we're all experiencing that's making it much more difficult to manage scarcer and less reliable water sources. And from that perspective, we see digital technologies as really being transformational. And what we're seeing within the sector is this sort of transition to a new paradigm of urban water management, a new normal, where the water sector is going to become more low carbon, and also we're moving much more to a circular economy. And so from that perspective, we see digital as an enabler that allows us to transition to this new normal, allowing us to do more with less, and ultimately decoupling our economic growth from our water consumption. And this is a fairly complex problem, because we're moving into a much more sort of systems perspective of our systems. But technology digital technology particularly is going to help us. It's moving very fast. We see acceleration taking place in relation to microchips, in relation to software, storage, sensors, and all of this is being fused into the cloud. And so connectivity itself is becoming fast, free, and ubiquitous. And so, and storage also is fast, free, and easy to use. And so the cost of complexity has crashed. So I think the opportunities for the water sector, and what we're seeing through our digital program, is we're moving away from sort of assumption-based management to sort of more data-driven management. And that's where we're not only using historical data to support our decision-making, but we are combining that with real-time data, and we're doing much more sort of predictive analytics. And the data that we're using and harnessing is really being translated in a way that allows us to become much smarter and wiser in the way in which we manage systems. So from our perspective, we see many potential opportunities, from, if you take the urban water cycle, the way in which we optimize our processes themselves, our treatment processes, both in terms of drinking water and wastewater, in terms of sort of managing our regulatory compliance requirements. Even the way in which we are interacting with customers has improved a great deal. And, I always say that water is a system of systems of systems. And our ability now to really have this sort of helicopter view of the entire watershed and understand some of the transfer of benefits that take place between those different aspects of the watershed are going to be critical. So from an IWA perspective, it's our ability to manage complexity that's really an essential requirement now when we're living in a world with global change pressures and lots of uncertainties associated with those global change pressures. Thank you.
Thanks, Kala. Vinod?
Hey, thanks. We talked about this whole mega trend, but I think also the water challenges at the second level, if you see that all around, Asia Pac, both developing country and underdeveloped countries, now the high energy cost, and this is increasing cost, the coastal risk, and and also the droughts and floods, water scarcity, the city water resilience need for those, capital constraint, too many projects chasing only few capitals, aging workforce, aging infrastructures, and the regulatory compliances. And also what has happened that we have not invested enough since World War II in water sectors. We are still using the technology what we used to use just after World War II. And there's incremental improvements in those technology. So what is required a paradigm shift? And the paradigm shift is enabled by the digital, as Kala said that. And common water challenges which water agencies are looking, which we see from our client as a private service provider, like reduce the operating cost, extend the life of existing facilities, how to stretch the existing assets, how do you optimize energy, less energy, more from less, enhance the safety, data privacy, and the protections as such. So these are the things which will be enabled by the digital technology, and even the digital technology, what we have been using is kind of collecting the census data and using those data to make the decision at the operator level. And those are the very point sources of data. I think with the new technology, we can collect this data, have a 360 view of all assets, unify this data and create the insight, and that lets insight drive the whole efficiencies, which leads to operational excellence, energy cost optimization, better customer and community engagement. And this could be a very progressive, very incremental, but leading to the goal we want to achieve. One of the other constraint, also the driver, which has been because whole water sector is a very, if you see that the sector is very fragmented, very local, and the supply chain is broken, not very integrated compared to many other sectors as such. And that's, I think, data-driven approach will help us to kind of integrate that supply chain.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vinod. So our next round, we will ask some specific questions to each of the panelists. I'll start with Nita. And we would like to ask, what is the role that ADB is playing in promoting digitalization of water entities in ADB's client countries? And what are their specific needs and what are the constraints among those developing countries?
Thank you, Thomas. Yes, in a nutshell, if I may, at ADB, we are playing the role of explainers, influencers, capacity builders, funding and knowledge partners, facilitators, and if I can use the word, honest brokers or connectors from the solution providers to the end users to promote digitalization. We have a very large water sector portfolio of over $26.4 billion. So we bring that presence and we work predominantly through project lending modalities, which means we are on the ground with water entities, be it urban, rural, water service providers, or resource managers, irrigation managers, and ministries. And the needs, going to the needs aspect, are quite large. And I already mentioned our baseline is fairly low. What we see in many countries, the standard customer asset database, billing services, quantity quality monitoring, simple early warning systems, they all by and large missing in our region. So sky's the limit in where we can grow. So at ADB, again, what we find or have found over the years is the constraint is not financing per se. Constraint is by and large awareness, apprehension, and capacities. That's what we have seen. We were at a very low point of digitalization, maybe even 10 years back. Our projects, when we look back, would have some capacity building towards one small aspect of digitalization. And over the years, we have been very progressive. Last year's lending for us in the water sector was just below $3 billion. And we had 72% of our projects with some digitalization component. So it's steadily growing. So obviously, we are playing a good role of what I said, influencers, capacity builders, knowledge promoters, and financiers. And I always use the word demystifying, this what it is about. And one example I give that we did quite well last year is we synthesized what had gone in the past, and we also called on the industry to say, come and join our e-marketplaces. We did 2 of them. And we got 118 solution providers from all over the world to come and explain what the solution would do, which we call demystify the solutions. And then we heard from our client side and we tried to synthesize what the clients wanted in terms of the pace that they could adopt. So if you allow me to synthesize some of the learnings that we found in what we're doing, and that also links to what other actions we are taking. So first, we are helping the entities better understand these technologies, better understand their own capacities, and prepare plans themselves for an incremental uptake of technology. And we are doing that through different technical assistance that we have. We are hiring experts, smart water expertise. We have just impaneled 29 experts in the field of climate resilience and digitalization, which we can mobilize at a quick call when needed. And these master plans that they're preparing are at their own pace. We are promoting, do it incrementally, do what your capacities can sustain, and we help them pilot and upscale. So that is the first initiative. We are also helping them twin with other entities. For instance, we have just helped an entity in Sri Lanka and Nepal water entities twin with K-Water and KRCC in Korea, who are quite strong in their digitalization expertise. Similar efforts are going on with PUB in Singapore with other entities. We have just launched this water resilience hub, where we are again trying to bring everything that exists out there in terms of resilience, in terms of digitalization, home to our water entities. And we work with over 1,000 water sector entities in the region, all over 46 developing member countries. Now, another effort we are making is in sustaining the digital interventions. So looking at aligning these digital piloted services with wider system changes. Because what we have learned over the last 10 years, wherever we have tried, is this adoption doesn't happen overnight. And if it does, it's not sustainable. So what can we do in terms of the wider change management, in terms of sustaining that capacity, building that capacity to sustain the interventions? And this is where we really put a lot of emphasis, looking at organizational strategies, structures, policies, work processes that will need to be adjusted within the entities. And the second, I already mentioned, to upscale the piloting, because again, small grant funding that we can provide to allow some uptake of technologies goes a long way to show to the policymakers that it can be sustained. And lastly, looking at who is it for? We always ask these questions. Is it for the most vulnerable? Is it for customer servicing? Where is that area that technology is most needed? Because you can go completely wild with technologies. You know, at home I buy iPhone 1, 2, 3, keep upgrading. You have to ask, you know, sky's the limit. So is it for reducing your non-revenue water because you are resource constrained? Is it for serving the most vulnerable because they are really being disaster impacted? For instance, in West Bengal, where we had project, this question was asked in a way that we could answer. So really focusing on the vulnerable, upscaling, piloting, being the honest broker, and looking at each of our project on where are the entry points and where can it be sustainable in the long run. So I'll stop here. Thank you, Thomas.
Great, thanks, Nita. That's great, especially on the to bring that innovation from the tech startups that don't know how to work with in the industry as a big opportunity. All right, so Monica is next, and I think Monica, you're going to share your presentation on where water sector sits compared to other infrastructure sectors. Go ahead, Monica, thanks.
Yes, that's right. Thank you, Thomas. And that was a really interesting presentation as well, Nita. And I think some of the data that I will be sharing shortly kind of taps into some of the things that you were talking about then. And hopefully you can see the right screen. Can you see that clearly?
Yes.
Excellent. And I'm sharing slides because I have some data that I'm going to be talking about. It's always challenging when someone's talking about data trends without actually showing the data. So I thought I would share some visual aids. So I guess before I get into the presentation, just a really quick note on the Global Infrastructure Hub and why we're actually involved in the topic of technology. So we're a not-for-profit that was established by the G20 in 2014. And our mandate is really to be able to partner with the G20 Ministries of Finance, and I guess more specifically the Infrastructure Working Group, to help them develop and deliver an aspirational and impactful agenda when it comes to infrastructure that can really sort of influence the discourse and the activity across the industry. And being able to produce database insights to help stakeholders make more informed decisions is actually one of our key focus areas. And then obviously, working with partners to be able to share that knowledge and facilitate connections and opportunities. And, in certain cases as well, to be able to advocate for change through some of our work and thought leadership. And our work under technology kind of falls under that technology leadership, part of our strategy. So, I will take you through some of the data in three parts. So the first is looking at the total investment into infrastructure and some of the long-term priorities, of which digitalization is one. And then the second is we'll be tapping into the digitalization investments at the G20 level and look to see where the water sector fits in. And I'd be very interested in getting some of your views, Nita and Thomas and even Kala on any data sets that you might have that may complement or maybe validate this kind of perspective. So interested in that kind of debate. And also just looking at the opportunity for water technology in the climate transition as well. So this is just a snapshot of what we found through our InfraTracker project. So, we looked at total investment trends and long-term priorities across the G20. And it's probably unsurprising that transport kind of sits at the top of that list. But this particular InfraTracker was looking primarily at infrastructure as a stimulus, as a way to track infrastructure investment trends in response to COVID, because these are technically supposed to be the rather innovative and aspirational infrastructure packages coming from national governments. This is really looking at how infrastructure is being used to bring about sustainable economic recovery. And to put this total figure of 3.2 trillion into context, this is about a 50% increase per annum in terms of infrastructure investment when we compare that based on 2019 figures. And if you compare that to the total stimulus packages across the G20 during the GFC, that was only like $2 trillion, or 2 to 3% of the GDP at that time. Even just the infrastructure component of the COVID response is even much larger than that. So you can get a sense that this is a substantial amount of money that what we're advocating for governments need to really direct into achieving what we're calling transformative outcomes, which is the long-term priorities component here. So water sits at about 7% of this total investment trend. And if you break this down between emerging markets and advanced economies, it's about the same. But it's probably important to point out that these are national government investment figures. And, Kala, as you've mentioned, water is a very sort of local activity. And so there's a lot of investment that's happening at subnational level that we're not capturing through this particular data set. But there are some interesting insights nevertheless. So in the context of this additional spending and being able to really influence governments to put this kind of funding into achieving transformative outcomes, we actually identified what the G20 was actually thinking of in terms of transformative outcomes from these planned infrastructure investments. And there are 13 here, but I really just wanted to draw your attention to the top 4, which is a low carbon transition, affordability, inclusive mobility, and digitalization. And so this is for infrastructure as a whole, not yet delving into the water sector. And I also just wanted to give a special mention to disruptive innovation, which is an 8%, primarily focused on hydrogen and zero emissions vehicles infrastructure. But I guess in my presentation, I'll just be focusing, primarily on the low carbon transition and the digitalization components as the two most relevant to this particular forum. So when we delve a little bit deeper into these water investment figures, and this chart shows where national governments see an alignment between water investments and achieving transformative outcomes. So you have the transformative outcomes on the left there and the water investments on the right. And I'm not expecting you to decipher this diagram at all. But the premise, I guess, is that if this is where national government is thinking that water investments can have the most impact. So, looking at pollution reduction, environmental regeneration, circularity, affordability, then this in theory is where technology and innovation should be focused, because there is funding available at the national level. And, there's already been some work to go into it to say that there is actually going to be quite a substantial return on investment from an economic perspective. And technology has the potential to maximize those benefits. So this is a good starting point. But I wanted to point out actually the low carbon transition and digitalization elements of these transformative outcomes or these long-term priorities, which are relatively small compared to some of the others. And I suspect that this might be surprising to many of you, given that achieving a low carbon transition and digitalization are actually really big strategic areas for the water sector. And, Nita, just touching on your point that, you've spent $3 billion on water infrastructure and 72% of that is digital. I think kind of goes to show that at the national level, that is not so much a focus, which is kind of interesting and I guess takes me into the next slide in terms of where governments are focusing investments with regards to digitalization. So when we break this down based on the transformative outcome of digitalization, national governments are primarily trying to achieve this kind of outcome through digital infrastructure, which is unsurprising. So things like digitizing healthcare and education, data centers, and wireless infrastructure. But also interestingly, the second largest is on making disaster management infrastructures smarter. And so that includes infrastructure that helps to, for flooding adaptation. And I guess you're probably wondering where water is in this. So it's a small sliver down the bottom of about 0.07%, which I just wanted to say shouldn't be something you should be too concerned about, because this is sort of the figures that we've seen from the national investment trends, and given that water investments are mainly happening at the subnational level, but this does kind of have a point in that maybe there is a lack of data to prove what the contribution of investing in water technology could be to achieving long-term priorities at the national level, and actually being able to influence, say, the ministries of finance who are setting budgets and actually, seeking finance for infrastructure projects that, this is a sector that we should be focusing on in the future. So there is a data gap here, I think, that needs to be filled. And keen to speak to those sort of working in this space in terms of whether they have any insights in that respect. So the third section is really looking at the water technology opportunity for the low carbon transition. So the low carbon transition being one of the sort of equally small focus areas for water investments, similar to digitalization. We did some work last year in terms of quantifying infrastructure's contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions. And, depending on how you cut the data, you come up to different figures. So the way that we define infrastructure, we've seen that, 53% is contributed through infrastructure. But I believe that the World Bank, has recently quoted something of about the order of about 80%, because that includes sort of energy infrastructure for manufacturing as well, which is something that's not included in here. But when we look at the water and wastewater contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, it's about 5% of infrastructure's emissions in total. So I guess 2.5% of total greenhouse gas emissions. And that's from an operations perspective. So those are emissions from water and wastewater operations. And I guess if you were looking at the construction element, there would also be a share there in terms of embodied carbon from construction. From our research, that data didn't seem to be hugely available. So keen to sort of open up a conversation about that as well. Now, when we map potential solutions to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and, looking at water and wastewater, we can see very broadly that there are two main types, which is, about, reducing the electricity consumption or shifting that electricity consumption to renewables in water and wastewater, but then also addressing the wastewater process and the emissions that the wastewater process are actually emitting into the atmosphere through the treatment process. So look, there's probably more that I can say about this, but I'll probably just finish up by maybe raising a few questions. And the first is there enough data to prove the benefits of investing in digitalization in water, sort of at the national level? The second is what can be the role of water in the climate transition? So, if water and wastewater is potentially at about 2.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions, is it more about mitigation or is it more about adaptation? And, touching on that investment figure of disaster management infrastructure, which was actually quite large, should we focus more of our efforts on looking at water technology for adaptation, just to kind of touch on that kind of opportunity? And I shall end it there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Monica. And our next question is for Kala. And the question is, how can water and wastewater operations begin their digitization journey? And what are some key constraints?
Thank you, Thomas. I think what's really critical from our perspective is that both water and wastewater utilities need to ensure that digital is really embedded into the DNA of their organization. And we've been doing some work on that through the Digital Program Committee. And we've published a series of white papers, and we've actually looked at various utilities around the world, and we've tried to map where they are on what we call our digital maturity curve. And we've identified, those utilities that are performing particularly well. And what we find is the first sort of most important aspect that we see is really utilities that have an engaged leadership. And we're talking really about the executive team of the utility. And we found that was really fundamental in developing a foundation for advancing digital technologies within the organization and moving them up the digital maturity curve. We also found that expanding on existing roles within a utility, so establishing, for example, a chief digital officer within the utility, can again ensure that digital technologies remain a priority and are always within the top management. It's something that's always being emphasized at the executive level. Also, we found that it was important that when initiating digital projects, it has to be integrated throughout the entire utilities operations, right? And so it has to go from the bottom up all the way through the organization, and that it's actually quite counterproductive when you have initiatives that are very much locked into a particular vertical silo within the utility. When we look at constraints for utilities moving forward, we identified a couple of them, and we found that these constraints can slow down the implementation of digital solutions, but at worst, they can actually prohibit even the piloting of potentially transformative solutions. One of the biggest factors we found in terms of constraints, and as I said earlier, and I think Vinod touched upon this as well, water is a system of systems, right? So, at the sort of really lower level, what I call the sparrow's view, you might be looking at different elements of your water supply system or different elements of your wastewater system. And as you move up to sort of more the albatross view, if you like, you might look at the whole urban water cycle as one. So you're looking at both your drinking water and wastewater systems in their entirety with their stormwater systems. But as you move up to, say, much higher elevation, say the eagle's view, then you're really looking at the watershed, and you're understanding some of the connectivities that take place between water for food production and a city, for example, and water for industry in a city. So integration is really critical. And when you run a utility, the value really comes from integrating across the entire water cycle. And this requires really trying to bring all the data together. So we find within our digital program, we're talking much more about the integration of things rather than the Internet of Things. And, because we feel that the integration of things really focuses on value creation, right? Whereas the Internet of Things is really much more focused around technological solutions. So, for example, when you start integrating, a customer may be aware that there is some challenges upstream at the source level, and so their responses in terms of managing their water consumption to support, say, drought management initiatives can be much more proactive. And also, the wastewater management systems can be prepared for much low flow types of a low flow scenario that could occur as a result of upstream drought management. And sort of digital really allows you to sort of look at investments in one part of the water cycle that has knock-on effects throughout it. However, as I said, it's problematic within the utilities that we see because they do have a sort of very vertical siloed approach. So when you take, for example, metering of, say, drinking water supply, the metering companies just focus entirely on that part of their operations, and they don't understand how understanding water consumption, etc., can provide greater insights to manage the entire water cycle. Similarly, when we commission, say, a company to help us with our clarifiers in our wastewater treatment processes, it becomes very much locked in. The provision of that infrastructure, you get provided with that certain sensor technologies and data that locks you in. They're very sort of proprietary pieces of kit, but they don't sort of spread and support the management of the entire water system. And so these partial views that you currently see are very limiting. And as I said, it's really important to try and bring all this data together. The other thing is that, the water sector is potentially data rich, but as a sector, we are information poor, right? And what I mean by that is we generate a lot of data, but we only use a very, very small part of the data. I think it's been quoted that we use around 10% of the data that we collect. So we're collecting a lot of stuff that we don't really use in a productive way. And so this idea of how, figuring out how best to sort of collect, all the data we collect across the entire system, how that can be managed well. And within IWA, again, through the digital program, we're doing some work on sort of open architecture and standardization. And we feel that will provide a framework for, seamless integration of different data sets coming from different components of the water cycle. The other constraints that we see is in relation to human resources, right? So, when you're providing these technological solutions, you need to frame these solutions within your own workforce. And so the water sector could really benefit from additional research on the best practices in workforce development during the digital journey. And I think it's been mentioned already around some of the financial challenges. People don't want to be the first off the blocks, and I think we need to have more evidence-based information around the total value created by digital solutions. And that sort of, we need to generate sufficient arguments that encourage decision leaders to make the investments and to see potentially some of these efficiency gains that we are stating. I think sometimes the sector can exaggerate some of the value that's being created. And so having a much clearer understanding of attribution, how digital implementation really does result in a very clear value to the utility, I think is also important. The final possible problem that we see is, of course, around cybersecurity, and we're doing some work on that. When you have these vertical silo systems, you have lots and lots of different types of digital solutions in different parts of your water cycle. Things start to fall between the cracks, right? And so you don't have a very, if you like, a very complete and protected system. And so how you manage some of the challenges of interoperability and the vulnerability that creates if certain people have malicious intent is also a challenge. And it's something I think that, discourages certain utility decision leaders to move in this direction. So that would be, where I see some of the opportunities, but also some of the constraints. Back to you, Thomas.
Great, thanks, Kala. Very good points. And you also mentioned something about the workforce, and so that brings us to Vinod. And we actually are asking you on this very topic: how do we prepare our workforce for digital transformation in the water sector?
Thanks, Thomas. I think this is a very big topic, actually, and this is very contextualized because you can't have a one-size-fits-all. And there's a lot of this positive associated with the whole digital transformation, and the need for it and effort goes in. But there's also the negativity because there's a saying that 70% of digital transformation normally don't achieve what their intended goals are, and this is because of several reasons: upfront commitment, not having a right workforce, and putting the technology first. So there's an overlap between what Kala has talked about and my, the discussion point here, because I think there's the good synergy between those arguments as such. Normally what happens that digital technology is led by the technology, and which is kind of disaster. This has to be, we have to have the people at the heart of any digital transformation. And also, if you want this digital transformation to be, kind of sticky and remain sustainable, again, the people has to come first. And what has happened that always we believe, I mean, as for the Jacobs, and we have been doing some of those, the transformations, the utilities, we start with the digital maturity assessment of those utilities. And where are they on the journey of the digital, this transformation or the digital capabilities? Prepare a roadmap for it. And as part of the roadmap, we need to create the workforce development, talent management, and the training for it. The training is only one aspect, but how do we make this workforce enable to contribute as such? And I find, as Kala said, is a system of systems. The water supply is, unless you integrate the entire water cycle, entire supply chain, and entire project life cycle, you're not able to get huge benefits. Otherwise, will be the optimization happens at a very low level, which will move the needle. If you want to have a paradigm shift, it has to be globally optimized at a system level. And to do that, actually, there's a lack of individual or lack of people who understand ET, IT, OT, and I'm adding this empathy, which is our community and stakeholder as such. So there has to be people, and we need to develop those group of people who can understand all this and can develop a business architect and also the system architect, and then kind of create the work for others. We can bring in the technologies. So I think there's a lack of those people, and which can't be trained very overnight, and just require a systematic effort as such. Some of those, the work what we do within the organizations, large organizations, which remains in the people's minds, in their laptop, and they use it very effectively. But the moment they go out of the system, the tools and the digital product become useless. So how do we institutionalize what people have or the organization have as such? So I have these 5 points, and which has come from the various sources, including Neeta's blog actual. So the 5 points is creating the innovation culture, and which for culture for change that support the business transformation, making digital by default within the organization. So how do we create the digital by default and embed it as such, not a separate department as such, but embedding the entire the supply chain, entire what we do as such, right? And appointing as Kala said, a leader, and which leads the whole the training, the whole digital transformation with the help of their team, and identifying the digital champions, including the young people, digital natives, empower them, and the kind of this leads the sharing of knowledge, collaboration, and the whole digital transformation as such. Creating a trust between all level of employees, because there is always debate going on between the digital versus workforce, and which we have seen in the last several decades actually. Computerizers come because the digital will going to leads to the elimination of jobs. So how do we create trust between the employees and at all levels so that they are ready to accept the changes and learn and then get trained as such, right? Adequate training, reskilling, upskilling, and again, this is also we have this dilemma whether we train the people on a singular project, because water is a project based. Our projects are projects, and the projects are very always unique. You can't have a one iPhone, which you can produce millions of those products, right? So our projects are unique projects. So can we bring this digital on the project or enterprise level? So I think there's that's a agile and traditional project, which always we find a dilemma. So we need to create a people who can create the digital transformation at the enterprise level as such. Nita talked about having a strategy and alignment of that strategy with the end result in mind, which is again the business for the utilities, not for the AI and the technology as such, resulting in the more revenue, less cost as such, right? Clear communication, which is very important, so as to create that, bring these people on board, and the high level of acceptance, the less turnover, because what happens, the many people which you train get out of the system, and then again we pass out, lose that knowledge. Breaking silos, very important as well, because as we say that within the utilities or within the organizations, the best optimization comes by enterprise level of the systems. So the breaking the silos between the various departments and making the digital as embedded part of the whole supply chain and also the process as such. So these are the few things which I think we need to do to get our workforce prepared, apart from training and creating an enable environment for successful digital transformation. Thomas? Great.
Thank you, Vinod. Very insightful. So we are running a little bit behind, although we want to make sure to hear from the audience. We have an audience poll that is operating in the background. And before we finalize that, I just want to make sure everyone has been able to see it. You have a polling tab on the right-hand side of your screen. If you haven't seen it already, you can click on your answer. And the question is very simple. What is your organization's biggest challenge in respect to digitalization? And we have 4 options there. And if you haven't had a chance to do that, go ahead and click your answer. And I think that we will then show the results, not to spend too much time on it. So I don't know if are we going to show, oh, there it is. Okay. So the result is 60% is slow uptake of technology and innovation. Nobody is mentioning poor data capture methods and data quality. And I think this is something that Kala said very clearly, that we have a lot of data and it's just not being used very well. So this is very well lined up, the slow uptake and lack of innovation. So that's great. Then we will go back, since we only have about 8 minutes left. We will go through and do another quick round. I'm going to start with Kala. It's difficult to convince water organizations to make the high upfront investments in technology. And you mentioned this, we need the business cases, but what would you say? Do you have an example of a business case for investing in technology?
Well, there are some very good, thanks, Thomas. There are some very good examples of benefits as a result of investments in digital solutions. And you see that both in terms of the global south and also the global north. When we look at the global north, we are seeing these opportunities, when we think about infrastructure, right? I use this analogy where we have elephants, horses, and hares. And elephants are our sort of grey infrastructure, the concrete infrastructure that we have, which were really, as I think Vinod said, we built everything based on 19th century principles. But the horses are our machines, our stirrers, our pumps, our valves. And then we have the hares, right, which is the digital technology, the sensors and the software that supports that. And the reason we use this analogy is because, these animals have different gestation periods and they have shorter lifespan. They have different lifespans. So the elephant has a long gestation period and a long lifespan, whereas the hare has a very short gestation period and a short lifespan. So digital technologies move very, very fast, right? That, both in terms of their development, but then how long they survive within their operation. And what we're finding within our sector, where we're moving to sort of more low carbon solutions, we're having to repurpose our elephants, our sort of large concrete infrastructure. And the way we're repurposing them is by playing with our horses, the mechanical devices that we have, and which change the physics of our process and digital technologies. And so you're seeing great efficiencies appearing in the way in which we say, for example, manage sludge, thermal hydrolysis process. We need much tighter stoichiometric control, and it's only through digital innovation that we can do that. You also see similar types of approaches in the global south. For example, when we're looking at, say, for example, non-sewered sanitation, this idea of having sensors that inform call centers of when septic tanks have to be desludged, and those call centers are then able to connect desludgers in a way that they can optimize their routes for collection of the fecal sludge so that they can reduce their overall cost. So there you'll have a much more efficient operation of your non-sewer sanitation system because desludging is happening more frequently, and the profitability of the collectors is improved because they're able to optimize their routes. And, feces is quite heavy, and so you want to carry the volume in a way that reduces your fuel costs as you move it around. One other thing I would say is that a lot of what we've talked about is around the internal monetization of data, right? It's around how we can improve our efficiencies and save money and, and reduce costs and so it's really about internal monetization of data. But what you're seeing, particularly organizations that are much further in the digital maturity curve, is that they're looking at how they might externally monetize some of the data that they collect. Now, the water sector is very badly behind if you compare us with the telco sector in terms of external data monetization. But the water sector is being quite creative in thinking about how some of the data that they are collecting, say in terms of consumer behavior, also in terms of, there's a lot of work on wastewater surveillance and epidemiology, how that can, say, for example, inform healthcare professionals in better managing, communities because they are able to understand, say, changes in people's habits and their behavior that might indicate some changes in the health status of that community. And you saw a lot of that, a lot of innovation in that space taking place during COVID, particularly in terms of, wastewater surveillance and it being a sort of a precursor to informing of, informing communities or governments around, how prevalent COVID was within a community. So you're seeing utilities now looking at data as a service, where and one area that you're seeing some innovation, which may be not good to speak around so early in the day, is smart toilets, where toilets are being built with sensors, where urine is being analyzed and feces is being analyzed, and that sort of starts to tell people what the health of an individual is, and that sort of informs their healthcare providers in terms of how to manage them. Because a lot of these gastroenteric sort of, when people have problems with their stomach, it's very anecdotal, right? They go to a doctor and they start saying, well, I think I felt like this yesterday and, something like that. Whereas with this more precise data, you can start to manage people's conditions much more precisely. So what I'm seeing is a lot of application in trying to better manage our water systems and trying to get internal efficiencies, which sort of allow us to internally monetize some of those investments. But now, particularly with water utilities that are further down in the digital transformation, they're looking at how to externally monetize some of the data that they're collecting.
Great. Thanks, Kala. And I think that idea of looking for new revenue opportunities really will drive a lot of innovation. So we are almost, I think we have 1 minute left, and we will move to the wrap up. And I think that there is a graphic that, I don't know if we're going to look at the graphic of the session. And if not, okay, I think it's coming up. Yes, so thanks for, this is basically our summary, which is very useful because it helps bring it all together. I would just say, this is something that you can take away. It's great as adding to the notes. And I just want to thank the audience for listening and participating, and thank our 4 panelists for your great insights. And I just wish we had more time. And also thanks to all of the folks who have helped us put this together. So I think with that, we can close the session. I don't know if there's any other things we have to do. Sorry.
Thomas, if I may, we just want to invite everybody to continue joining the sessions also. So we have another day and a half to go with Asia Water Forum. Please do join. Thanks, Thomas and colleagues.
Thank you.